This chapter 1 will devote to the memory of my well-tried friend Alexander Brown, being the first man I became acquainted with in the West, first meeting him at Austin in 1849. He was then a wagon master for the government, having in charge 30 wagons and teams. The confidence placed in him by the United States was never betrayed. His teamsters loved him. He was one of the most efficient officers I ever met. In 1852, we were thrown together and participated in some of the many Indian troubles in Burnett and the surrounding counties. He was a bachelor, and with 7 other bachelors they took dinner on a lone mountain in Lampasas County, and it has ever since been called Bachelor's Peak. I was one of the jury inquest. His death is still wrapped in mystery. I first met Alex Brown in Austin in 1849. He was a man of unyielding firmness and sterling integrity qualities, which stood him well in hand, and entrusted as he was, during his 3 or 4 years of service, with millions of dollars of property, and through a country thronged with roving bands of that untamable war, like ofttimes murderous tribe the Comanches. Notwithstanding the vigilance of the military at the different posts, Alex had several brushes with Indians, 3 or 4 of which assume serious proportions, especially at Howard Springs Canyon, where a gang of over 200 Comanche swooped down on the wagon train to capture it, but Alex had formed the wagon securely into a corral. The boys had practiced so long, until they knew just how to form a corral with neatness and dispatch, and there 30 of them stood off the Comanche until help came from the post. At one time, almost the entire train load consisted of bullion, silver bricks, but a special guard accompanied this part of the journey. Alex was in most of the Indian fights in Burnett, Lampasas, and San Saba counties as a volunteer. He rendered good service in the fight on Buffalo Prairie, where we put them to fight and recaptured about 200 or 300 head of stolen horses. Alex always seemed to want to avoid bloodshed if possible. I remember one little incident where he walked up and cut the bowstrings of a belligerent young Indian, and without doing anything else, but to quietly wait for some further demonstration, thus probably keeping a row from being started that might have been indefinitely prolonged and many lives lost. There are many other incidents we might relate, but refrain. Alex had a noble horse he called Shanghai. Shanghai loved his master, and saved his life once in the Colorado River by swimming back at his master's call to where he had floated and lodged on a rock, and swim out again and save with him. If there was anything that equals Shanghai love for his master, it was his hatred and fear of Indians. They had tried to catch him so often that Alex would always guess pretty well when Indians were about by Shanghai galloping up to the door and laying. One morning, he galloped up near Mrs. McCrae's, 5 miles south, with a lariat and an Indian chief full rig on, including a beautiful shield, which was afterwards sold to a relic hunter for $20. Alex bought a good farm on Lynch's Creek, Lampasas County. He remained a bachelor. He was one of a party of bachelors who ate their dinners a Christmas dinner, I believe on Bachelor's Peak on the line of Burnett and Lampasas County, a few miles from Lampasas, hence the name Bachelor's Peak. The actions of some of these old bachelors were in marked contrast to some of the old Texans, many of whom married 3 or 4 times, and often young wives at that. We don't know how many reasons outside of pure neglect these batches could have had for unwisely remaining free and not becoming the slave of some good woman, and bringing some sunshine and sweetness into their old lives. Some of them were pure and noble men, and had unselfishly done much for the country. Many are details of the kindness and benevolence of Alex Brown. such as refusing to sell corn for the money to big cattlemen, saving it so his less fortunate neighbors could get bread, and many small kindnesses top numerous to mention, and he never failed to quietly and freely give food and wholesome advice. Some of his admonitions were what many might term old fogey, but we've to hear of the first one that hasn't proved true in the light of subsequent events. At an early day when many even in the first or best citizens gave themselves the benefit or a doubt when they came across an unbranded animal, and others resorted to downright stealing, Alex simply kept himself on, spotted from some mixed up and quietly, and simply observed that stealing added nothing to the wealth of the country, and that they ought to quit it, and he emphasized this just opinion on a few occasions we might mention, but refrain. While he always found himself on the side of the law and order, yet when the difficulties and wrongs assumed the shape of feud and war, he preferred to wait until he knew for certain that it was fully his time to take a full hand, one time, when called upon by an armed posse of determined citizens and asked to go with them and help us hunt the. He was really unwell at the time, and after a moment thought, he replied, "I haven't lost any." That was enough. He was a man of few words. Whether Uncle Alex, as he was familiarly called, acted unwisely in this we can't say, but that quaint expression has traveled the rounds and more current counties than this. A company of Rangers and a company of United States troops were brought in during this feud, and then it was not settled until many lives were lost. But we are digressing. We really know but little about these things anyway. We should not look altogether, but the somber side of life anyway. The shifting sands of time cause many changes, of course. The quiet victories of peace really have more place in history than at quarrels and strife. Living as Alex did by himself, he naturally became eccentric, like all bachelors to some extent, with no one to comfort them in their seasons of physical or mental worry. At one of these times, he conceived the idea that one of his buildings and a few of his personal effects didn't suit him exactly, and that the best way was to burn them and commence again. When remonstrated with, he replied that was the best way to get rid of anything that didn't suit at all, and also that the Lord would be pleased if many things in our lives could be done the same way, i.e. wipe out and begin anew. While this was perfectly plausible, yet it was thought best to put him under the care of a friend for a few weeks until Alex was him old self again, cheerful and hospitable. But the religious impressions which seemed to have been made before or about this time were deep and blasting, and outside of uncouth and impatient remarks at the time, his life was one of purity, honesty, charity, and kindness, though exceedingly firm and unyielding in his ideas of right and best, which, by the way, were nearly always proven correct. His tomb, a beautiful shaft of Burnet granite, bears this inscription, taken from one of his letters written about this time: "We learned my heart was well cleansed. God was the potter, I was the clay. Lord, thy will, not mine, be done." Alex was brutally murdered on the last night of the year in 1886, and from the indications of fierce struggle and the absence of $32 he was known to have had, and also evidence of torture, it was thought he was murdered for his money. Sufficient evidence to convict his murderers had not yet been obtained, and a portion of it is yet to some extent an unsolved mystery. Alex Brown was born in Alabama and came to Texas when a young man, as did two of his brothers, John and Oliver. John was killed and scalped by Indians, and Oliver, the oldest, who was a newspaper man in North Alabama, came to Texas to help the Patriot in their unequal struggles for independence and was slain in Goliad. Alex once remarked when we were surrounded by Indians that we knew as a general rule they were our enemies and governed ourselves accordingly. But now in these type of peace, we don't know exactly who our friends are, nor who our enemies. Words true to his case, for the indications were that the men who murdered him first entered his house as a friend. Alex Brown was one amongst the noblest men I ever met, and wish to embalm his name in my book.